I'm Eva, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of The Charm of It, a podcast for knitters who share my fascination with the nitty-gritty details of our craft. One moment. We have confiscated the pink elephant squeaky toy, and therefore, hopefully, Thistle will stop making noise. If you're a returning viewer, it is so nice to see you again. And if you are a new viewer, I'm really glad that you came across my little corner of the internet. You can expect to see lots of projects that combine pretty details with practical silhouettes that work well in my wardrobe in muted cool colors, which are my favorites. Unless I'm gift knitting, and then all bets are off. And as you can see, both Moth, my cat, and, well, you can't really see, Thistle, my dog, are joining us for this episode, so there's Moth. Hopefully they will keep the distractions to a minimum. It's been a couple weeks, so I am sorry about that. The last 2.5 weeks have been really rough for a variety of reasons that we don't really need to get into. But luckily things are looking up now, and so I'm really glad to be back and talking with you. I'm one of those people who uses knitting as a coping mechanism, so when things are rough, I tend to knit even more, which means I have quite a few finished objects to show you. In case you are a new viewer, I do 2 different types of episodes. The Project Snapshot episodes are only about works in progress, and then the bigger episodes like today's include quite a few segments, as well as talking about finished objects. Today I will be reviewing a knitting book. For the topic, I'll be talking about this great new Ravelry group that I joined called the Harry Potter House Cup. I hope that that's what it's called. Anyway, and all of my show notes are just in the description box down below this video on YouTube. You can find links to all of the project pages for everything that I talk about, and from there you can get to patterns and yarn details. I always include links to yarn and books that I've reviewed, the names, and everything like that. So look there. If you have any questions that are not answered by the project pages or the notes down below, feel free to leave comments on YouTube. It's probably the simplest way for those kinds of questions. I'm also on Instagram and Ravelry as The Charm of It, and I love hearing from you. With all that said, let's get to finished objects. First, I need to take a sip of tea. Oh, and I should warn you, this is one of those episodes where I'm waiting for a call, and as soon as it comes in, I have to answer. So if there's a sudden abrupt cut, that's why. I'm just staring at this pile of finished objects, and I don't even know where to begin. Okay. We'll start with the ones you've seen before, if you're a returning viewer. These are my 4. My cat is a needy cat. She likes lots of attention. Anyway, 4th time's the charm leg warmers, and their name is because this yarn has been knit into 2 sweaters before becoming the mitten and leg warmer set. And so the mittens are called 3rd time's the charm, and then when I started the leg warmers, I ended up having to rip out the first leg warmer, so 4th time is the charm. The primary yarn is Quince & Company Lark in the colorway Bird's Egg. Lark is their worsted weight 100% American wool yarn, and Bird's Egg is just this really beautiful muted blue color. So there you can see it as a close-up. The contrast colors for the embroidery are, this is Knit Picks Wool of the Andes Sport Weight and Sapphire Heather. This is Blacker Yarns Tamar Luster Blend in Ottery. And this is Blue Moon Fiber Arts Gaia Fingering in Deep Unrelenting Gray. That last one is left over from a sweater that I knit. The other 2 are yarns that other knitters have sent me as gifts. We're going to have focus issues today. Anyway, so I really like that I was able to incorporate some of that into the project. I've tweaked the focus settings a little, so hopefully I will no longer be a blurry talking head. I absolutely love how these turned out. They make me so happy. I think that they're incredibly beautiful, and they just kind of remind me of that Louis the Sun King court French Rococo style. I suppose the Italians enjoyed that too. and I really love the effect of adding the embroidery to the twisted stitches. This combination is a tradition from Austria, and it's called the Tyrolean tradition, and I definitely plan to use it more. I first read about it in a book called Knitting in the Old Way, and she talks about Tyrolean cardigans. So it's been in the back of my mind as something I wanted to try for a while. But this particular pattern, I used the Innsbruck Mittens and Leg Warmer set from the book Vintage Modern Knits, which I got from my library. And I've now knit 4, I believe, of the patterns. So that's the book that I'm going to review later in the episode. And yeah, the backs are just plain twisted 1x1 rib. And I don't think they look particularly great. I haven't blocked these yet, but they're the backs of my legs. I don't have to look at them, so it doesn't really matter. And this is only the second pair of leg warmers that I've knit, but the first pair I actually find incredibly practical because in the winter I enjoy wearing very full 100% wool thrifted skirts, and they usually come to just below my knee. And so that part of me is very warm, but then my calves can get a little chilly, especially when I'm indoors, because when I'm outdoors I have knee-high wool-lined boots. So I think that leg warmers immersive weight yarn might actually be one of those oddly practical projects that I should make more of, so we shall see. And I have enough yarn left over. I have the entire body of the second sweater still to frog. So I'm going to make a scarf, and I'd already planned to make a scarf, but I was just going to make it with a different pattern, and figure that it would match the mittens and leg warmers just because it's the same color. But I'm so in love with how this design turned out that I'm going to adapt it to be a scarf. And of course, this kind of pattern has a very definite right side and wrong side row. So I was trying to think of how I was going to adapt that. I'm sorry, I shed everywhere. Anyway. And I've decided to do a keyhole scarf. So that means that one end will be a loop and the other end tucks through it. So that way that second end will be displayed, and then there's not the same amount of like twisting and turning that other scarves might do. And since it's a worsted weight yarn, as long as I knit it with enough stitches around the neck, and I might just do ribbing for the neck section versus the pattern twisted stitch, it should still be nice and snug and cozy, even in the one layer. So I'm not sure when I'll cast that on. Since I've knit this pattern for 2 mittens and 3 leg warmers, I thought it would be nice to take a bit of a break, but I'm sure I'll cast it on within, say, a month or so, because this design is going to go really beautifully with one of my winter coats, which is a vintage coat that I found on eBay right before I moved up here. I live in western New York in the Snow Belt region, and before that I lived in South Texas, so I knew that I was going to need some warmer gear, and it is a vintage German coat. I think it's Loden wool. It's kind of felted, and it's incredible. It's got a full skirt and then princess seam bodice, and it's got a cape that buttons on and off and a hood that buttons on and off and some embroidery. And it's a middle blue color that is quite similar to this embroidery. I was so lucky to find that on eBay, and it keeps me so warm. The first winter that I moved up here was one of the coldest winters on record here, and I believe throughout the month of February it never got above freezing, even during the highs of the day, and it was frequently a high of like 8 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know what that is in Celsius. I should know. Nope. Anyway, and that was without wind chill factor or anything. And so everyone else I saw on the street was in puffer coats, but my vintage wool coat was perfectly fine. I was still super comfy and warm and going for long walks, so I think that that will be a really excellent final use of the yarn. I'm so glad that it finally found its true home. Oh, I should say, so I have a little bit of embroidery experience, but not very much. And I'm very new to embroidering on knit objects as opposed to either little felted ornaments or, you know, just flat fabric. That's what I want to say. Sorry, both the pets have decided to start grooming themselves right next to me, so if I seem distracted, that's why. I'm glad that they're not on camera, so you're not subjected to that. Anyway, so there's been a very big learning curve, but I've to the point where each leg warmer took me between an hour and a half or 2 hours to embroider. Most of that time was the French knots. I actually enjoy, and I'm pretty good at making flat knots in kind of flat surface embroidery, but because this was, you know, a tube, so I'm trying to make sure the needle only goes through one layer and then trying to hold it really tight, and yarn needles get fatter at the top, and with French knots you have to pull that yarn tightly as you're pushing the needle through, but then a yarn needle needs more space to get through. So the French knots were definitely the fiddliest part, and that's why they look a little wonky, but I still like it. So I'm going to show you the wrong side, because I showed you the wrong sides of the mittens, especially the first one, so you could see how terrible my starting point was. And I think I've gotten much better at it. So essentially what I'm doing is I use one color at a time, and I worked up vertically, and then if I had enough yarn, I would work back down. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. And I would join it, so I would loop the yarn over itself, so both the ends are on one side, and there was a loop on the other side. Then I would thread that loop through the yarn needle, put the yarn needle under a stitch. Let me see if I can find one. Right here. So do you see that loop? So I would put that under a stitch on the wrong side and then draw the two ends through and pull it tight. So that secured that yarn at the beginning without any ends for me to weave in later. So that neatens things up. And then at the end, so for each spot I would work the embroidery, and then I would weave the yarn as I went up to the next place that needed the embroidery. There we go. So I was weaving as I went. I started with the French knot ones. And I would weave up, then do embroidery, weave up again, do some more embroidery, and then eventually when I ran out of yarn, I would leave the ends, and then I just wove those in at the end. So I had many fewer yarn ends to weave in. And I think it makes for a much neater look at the end. And it means you're not constantly snarling up other ends. So I did hold. The gray and beige yarns are both fingering weight, and I held them both double, but the sport I held single. If I were doing it again, I would probably hold the French knot yarn single because they are quite chubby. But since I had started holding it double on the mittens, I really wanted to make sure that everything kind of looked uniform. I adapted the pattern a little bit. I have to start a new segment, and then I will tell you. The pattern is written to be top down, and I instead knit it bottom up after the first disastrous leg warmer so that I could try it on as I went and increase as necessary. My increases are in different places than their decreases were, but I did end up with the same stitch number that they recommend casting on to begin with, so I probably could have just knit it to pattern and it would have been fine. But the first pair of leg warmers that I knit are definitely too large to stay up on their own. They stay up fine when they have tights to stick to, but so I wanted to make sure that these would be a nice snug fit, and just seemed, it's a lot easier when you're going this way, you know, since if you're going down, then you have to be committed to how many stitches you're starting with. So that was the only modification I did. I tried, usually, so I knit small circular knitting things on double pointed needles because they're my favorite, and I almost always have the work on 4 needles and use a 5th to go around. But because this chart had center stitches crossing, I tried to just have this whole chart on 1 and then the back one on 2. So I was using 3 with a 4th to go around, and it was just as miserable as I remembered. So the DPNs were sticking into me the whole way. I had a few more issues with laddering. Well, I guess not. You can't really. There's a little bit of laddering on the back in the purl. Luckily, ribbing hides that. And it just, yeah, I am definitely a 5 DPN person. So if you've only tried knitting with double points, using 4, 3 for your work and a 4th to go around, try using 5 because it makes a huge difference with the ergonomics. And of course, depending on how you hold the needles, I know some people really love to have their work on 3, so, but just saying, maybe DPNs are for you, you just haven't found the right number. And then for the bind off, I ended up doing Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind off just right here, and then the rest I did the invisible 1x1 ripstone bind off, which Ellie from Craft House Magic has just recorded a tutorial on. So I'll include that link as well as the link to the video tutorial that I learned from way back when I was a beginner knitter and have done ever since. I made it really stretchy because it's a sewn bind off, and I did not want to find that it was too tight and have to pull it out and redo it. It didn't need to be this stretchy, but the leg warmer is staying up fine, so better a little extra room than my calf losing circulation. Yeah. I'm really happy with how these turned out. They are going to be an entry for Jacqueline's Hipster Knit Along from the Brooklyn Knit Folk podcast because this pattern has less than 30 projects. So, excited about that. I also entered them in one of the Harry Potter House Cup classes, but we'll talk more about that later. Hopefully. This might be a long episode. Next up, just because it's on the top of the pile, we're not going in chronological order anymore, is the first of my Christmas gift knitting for the year. And you can tell that because this is not my color, purple. This is my purple. Anyway, last winter I knit myself just a plain garter stitch scarf. It was the first one I'd ever knit, which was kind of funny because I know that that's a common beginner knitter thing, but I'd never knit one. And I knit it out of this mauve alpaca yarn, and I put little tassels at the end, and I really liked it. And my mom really liked it too, so while I was down visiting for Christmas, we went to the local yarn store down there, and she picked out this worsted weight yarn. It's 100% organic cotton from Blue Sky Alpacas, and I can't remember what the colorway name is, but it is definitely on the project page, so that I could knit her a scarf of her own. And she lives in South Texas, so organic cotton is fine to keep the chill out. And so I made up this pattern myself because the pattern that I had used for the alpaca scarf only had the increases on one side, and that meant that the ends went like this instead of like this. So I decided that I wanted triangular ends. So I went ahead and I tried a few other patterns, but I couldn't make the shaping look good. By a few other, I mean one other. I was trying the No Purl Rib Scarf from Purl Soho, which is a free pattern. So I just decided to stick with garter stitch since that's what my mom liked. And after a couple tries with the increase rate, I settled on increasing on each end every 6th row. So that's 2 increases every 6th row. And that made this nice kind of tapered look. When I did it more frequently, it reminded me a little too much of a dishcloth. And I added pom-poms at the end. I used the Clover Pom-Pom Maker in the green color. A very nice knitting friend sent me her Clover Pom-Pom Maker since she wasn't using them. And it was a set of 4. So this was the second largest of those 4. I don't really know what size it's supposed to be. I have a little more trimming to do on them, but I really like how they turned out. And the middle of the scarf is nice and wide so that it gets squishy. I had gotten 3 skeins of this. It was on clearance sale at the yarn store. So it's not like it was terrible that I got 3 and only ended up using 2 skeins for the body, and then the pom-poms I got into the 3rd one. But I have quite a bit left over, which was a pleasant surprise. And as you can see, it can be worn in a few ways, and I like that the extra squishiness is around the neck. My mom is a little shorter than me, and I am only 5'3", which is, let's see, 157, 158 centimeters. So she is 2 inches shorter than me, or 7 centimeters. So I didn't want to make the scarf really long, so I think I made it about, let's see, yeah, it's longer than my wingspan, but not by too much, because I just find that more manageable for worsted weight, so that you don't end up kind of swallowed by the scarf, whereas I really like the giant stoles when they're in a lighter weight yarn. So that went by really quickly, and it was nice to get the first of my Christmas list knitting off the list. Next up is more gift knitting. I finished my dad's socks. These were his birthday / Father's Day gift, which both happened over the summer. Father's Day here in the US is in June, and his birthday is in July, so I definitely needed to finish up these socks. And he's actually coming up to visit in a couple of weekends, so I'm going to have him try them on then instead of mailing them to him. That way, if I need to make any changes, I can. But there are 2 of them, and they are in Knit Picks Stroll, which is a merino nylon blend. And I'm kind of worried about how it's going to wear because I attempted to remove all of Moth's fur. Oh, this is the navy colorway, sorry. It's a really dark navy. He picked it out. So I attempted to remove all of Moth's fur with my usual fur remover thing, and it definitely fuzzed up the yarn and made it look a little worn. I don't know if you'll be able to see it on camera. So that was the side that got the lint roller, and that's the side that didn't. So I was really not super pleased when that happened. I was like, why did you do that? That was pretty foolish, but that's okay. I think they still look really nice. And this is the largest pair of socks I've ever knit, but since it was just 1x1 rib for the cuff and then 3x1 ribbing for the body, I could do it while I was reading, so I really didn't mind it. It's 80 stitches on the leg and then 76 inches on the foot. And I've done 76 socks before. My father wears a shoe size 11 wide, so the length is an 11 and the circumference is the same as a men's 14. And yeah, I just followed the size chart from Sensational Knitted Socks so that I knew what to do. I added a little purl row right when the toe begins, just because I was dying at the lack of any kind of hand knit touches. And then I did a shaped toe, so the little toe side decreases more than the big toe side. The reason these are still so pointy is because I haven't woven in the ends yet, just in case I need to undo it and change the length when he tries them on. Anyway, because his feet are shaped a lot like mine, and I recently tried that shape of toe for the first time and found it super comfortable, so I am sure that he will as well. It's just nice for your big toe to have more space. So there you have it, basically sleeves. As socks for my dad. And this will be the first pair of hand knit socks that I've made him. He never expressed any interest in them, but when I finally offered, he definitely seemed excited about it. So maybe he just didn't want to ask because he thought it would be too much work. I don't know. I love knitting socks, so I don't mind knitting socks for people with larger feet. It's just more knitting. I have also been going through a phase where I want to knit softies, so I have a few of those to show you. I knit a lot of pumpkins, which was really fun. I only have 3 of them left, but I knit 10. First, I dyed the yarn myself because I did not have any orange yarn in stash. It's showing a little brighter on this screen than it is in real life. So I promise it's a pumpkin orange in real life. What about back here? I don't know. Maybe it's just the camera screen that's showing is brighter. But I used Bartlett yarns, their Air and Weight, which a kind podcast viewer sent to me to play with dyeing forever ago. And it was originally a kind of melon pink color, which was really pretty, but won't work for pumpkins, so I over-dyed it into this kind of pumpkin orange. And I actually was originally planning to also knit a fox from the Wee Woodland Wuzzies pattern, but I had so much fun knitting the pumpkins that I used up the entire skein. So one skein got me 10 pumpkins, 4 large ones, and 6 small ones, babies, and then various friends and family claimed various sizes, and I got to keep 3. And I actually am tempted to dye up some more yarn and knit more. The stems are brown yarn that was sent to me by another podcast viewer / knitting friend, Inez in Portugal, and this yarn was hand spun. So I really like that I can use it in this kind of home decor because then I can look at it all the time. And it's the perfect brown for pumpkin stems. I did not dye that or mess with it at all. Come on, focus. There we go. So I tried 2 different pumpkin patterns that use the same idea, where you knit a ball and you stuff it, and then at the end you take waste yarn, or not waste yarn, sorry, you take another length of yarn, you cut a really long end, then you take a yarn needle and you pull the yarn really tightly, and so it creates the pumpkin sections, which I thought was really clever and really easy because it meant you didn't have to fiddle with a lot of shaping. Come on. There we go. So see that? There it is. The yarn that's pulling that tight. And so the first pattern that I tried was the Knit Picks free pattern called Clove and Spice Pumpkins, I believe, and it's for both crochet and knitting, and you'll see it on the project page. That's the one I used for almost all the pumpkins. So that has you start with a fairly small cast on, and then you increase to your final width, and then you decrease. And I used different stitch counts because I was using heavier yarn. But since you're just knitting a ball, it worked really easily. And then you decrease with the crown. The other one that I tried is the Itty Bitty Pumpkin pattern, and that one has you starting with a larger number and not decreasing as much at the top. So you do a little more sewing up at the end, but you don't have to be, like, you don't have to pay attention to as many increases and decreases when you're on the needle. And I liked that one too, but I liked the Knit Picks one a little more. So I did one with the Itty Bitty Pumpkin, and then all the others I did were with the Knit Picks one. And I really liked how it was easy to vary the stitch counts and make different sizes. And when I saw that I wasn't quite going to have enough yarn to knit the 10th baby one, then I could just cut out a couple rounds and it didn't matter. My niece actually claimed that one, so it was the tiniest. And I just had a really good time knitting these. I knit them while reading kind of Gothic Halloween books, and it was kind of a celebration of fall because there was this glorious week of very autumnal weather at the beginning of September, and then a terrible heat wave happened that we will not talk about. But now it's autumnal again. So, yeah, that was a lot of fun. And I think I ended up using 180 yards, if I remember, for all the pumpkins. So I clearly was very into it. When the skein ran out, I was kind of sad that I couldn't keep knitting them. So I definitely recommend this if you're looking for a fun, very simple seasonal decor pattern. However, moth. So I've been keeping them sitting here when I'm not talking about them. And moth has shown an alarming tendency to think that the baby ones are cat toys. So luckily so far she hasn't knocked any of them under the furniture, but I've definitely come home from running errands and had to search for my pumpkins. Maybe I should knit her own pumpkin with catnip. Then maybe she'll leave mine alone. We'll see. So that was another finished object. We're getting through them. Next up are navy socks for me. A few weeks ago now, I did a Schrodinger's sock segment trying to decide what I was going to do with this yarn, which is Quince & Company Finch, which is their 100% wool in the fingering weight version, and Peacoat, which is their navy. It's a really beautiful navy. That's probably more true. And even though most people voted for the knee-high stockings, and I think they're beautiful, the truth is that I know I will wear short navy socks. During that week of cold weather at the beginning of September, I think I wore my old navy socks, which I don't like wearing very much because the yarn didn't wear well, so they look all scuffy, at least 3 or 4 times. So it was really a wardrobe pull for me, and so I decided that I definitely needed to go ahead and knit a pair of shorter navy socks. And I made the leg fairly short. They're not ankle socks, but they're not, I think, typical. Usually you do the same length foot as leg. So they're a little shorter, and that's because I like, when I'm wearing socks with my Oxfords or my T-strap flats or that kind of thing versus boots, I like to make sure that the sock ends before my calf starts growing because I wear a lot of knee-length skirts, and the slightly shorter socks looks a little more flattering. I mean, I'm perfectly happy looking like a hobbit, but I have definitely noticed that the slightly shorter socks make me look like a more elegant hobbit. So that's why I opted for the shorter leg on this. And it was really interesting. They only took 56 grams of yarn. I had 2 skeins. So I had 100 grams. So I had a bunch of yarn left over, and I'm already working on a pair of striped socks with some of that as leftovers. But let's talk about this pattern. So this is the, oh no, Distressingly, it's a Hunter Hammerson pattern, and it has a really fun name. So I'm going to look it up, since apparently I can't remember. Usually I'm good at remembering the names of patterns, if not the names of designers. It comes from her fairly recent book, Fine Things for Plain Occasions, where all of the patterns are inspired by passages that she found from vintage etiquette books. And my library has a copy, so that's where I got my copy of the pattern from. Singularly Disenchanting, that's what it's called. And so that passage in the etiquette book is talking about ladders and stockings for women. So Hunter Hammerson designed a sock pattern that deliberately uses drop stitches, and I love it so much. The reason why I decided that these would be a good match for this sock yarn is that I wanted something that would work for Tommy of Dynamite Trujillo, no, Squirrel Pie Productions podcast. She's doing a Deep Dark Night knit along for Halloween, and I knew this yarn color would work, so I really wanted a pattern that would work. And these dropped stitches really reminded me of kind of Gothic books with all those crumbling mansions and shattered mirrors and kind of shredded drapery. And then, of course, when the heroine is making her escape, I'm sure that she acquires ladders in her stockings. So I thought it worked really well. And then Quince & Company Finch is such a gorgeous, bouncy, tight twist yarn that even in the darker color, you can still see those twisted stitches. On the camera, when I pull it back, it's looking more invisible than it is in real life. And this way I got to have something that had almost lace, but it's not actually open, because I wanted these to be pretty solid socks for warmth. And the laddering pattern is only on half of each side. So half of the back, but the front pieces are solid as well as laddered. I've never done a deliberate ladder drop stitch pattern before. It was so much fun. So here's what the actual front looks like. Always the downside of sock blockers. As you can see, even without the focus, this part is just plain, and then this part has the ladders. Yeah, it was so fun to drop those stitches down. I kept knitting extra rounds just so I could get to another one where I could drop my stitches. So these socks took almost no time to finish between the shorter leg and the really enjoyable stitch, and then my desire to be knitting instead of thinking about various things. And I followed the pattern exactly, which is really rare for me, and that was partly because of one of the Harry Potter House Cup classes. That was the prompt, but you could have done modifications as well. But it was also just because I wanted to see what kind of socks Hunter Hammerson designs, because I really admire her design aesthetic, but I'd never actually knit one of her pair of socks before. And she writes a 56 stitch sock size, which is really nice for me because that is my preferred stitch count when working with Quince & Company Finch yarn. And I have to admit that while I loved doing these socks and I love the finished object, I don't think I would buy a Hunter Hammerson sock pattern. And that's because I had to do the heel twice and the toe 3 times on the first sock before I had figured everything out, and then I could just copy it for the second sock. And I think I don't mind doing that, but if I had paid like $6.50 for a pattern and I had to rip back and sort it out for fit issues, then that would probably make me a little bit cranky. So the issue with the heel flap is that you continue the patterning on it, which means that you're doing plain knitting, you're not doing slip stitch knitting. And usually heel flaps, you slip stitch every other row, which means that your heel flap ends up compressed. So with normal socks, even though I'm knitting them on 56 stitches, so the average would be a 28 row heel flap, but I do a 32 row heel flap because I have slightly higher arches, I think, for my shoe size. But I was really afraid that if I did a 32 row heel flap for this, it would end up really long because of the knitting. But even though you're doing plain knitting, so it's taller, she has you slip each stitch at the beginning and end the way that you would for a slip stitch heel flap. So when you go to pick up for the gusset, you're only able to pick up half the number of rows that you knit because you slip the stitches. So you don't have any more stitches to pick up into, if that makes sense. So when I did the first heel flap shorter, I just didn't have enough gusset stitches, so I got through maybe 3 of the gusset stitch decreases, and I tried it on, and it was just pulling and way too tight. So I had to rip back and redo the heel flap a little bit longer. So that was a little frustrating. And then the other issue was with the toe. So the pattern tells you to work the foot until you're 1.5 inches from the end, which is 4 centimeters-ish. It's really annoying that 1 inch equals 2.5 centimeters. Like, that is not the easiest conversion. I guess it would be more like 3 centimeters. Anyway, so that's what I did. And then I did the toe, and it was so short. I mean, my heel was being pulled way, way under. And I looked at it, and the toe is a really quick decrease. For my shoe size, it's only 10 total rounds. And the pattern calls for 8.5 stitches to the inch. She doesn't give a row gauge, but I don't know how you could get 1.5 inches of knitting out of 10 rounds when you're knitting 8.5 stitches to the inch. Because, of course, usually you require more rows or rounds per inch than you do stitches. So then I ripped back and added 6 extra rounds and knit the toe decreases again, and it was still too short. So I ripped back and added 6 more, so 12 full rounds more. And then did the toe decreases, and that worked. So essentially I knit almost the entire toe before starting the decreases because those decreases were so fast. So this is where come on. Okay, so this is where I started the toe decreases the first time, and that, let's see, you start the decreases and the purling, but, you know, I had to end up going way up. And in that case, because, I mean, the heel flap could have been, you know, user error on my part, but the toe was not user error on my part. So while I think I will continue to admire her aesthetic, and I think it's really great that she offers her patterns in so many stitch sizes, this pattern started at 56 and it went all the way to 88 in 8 stitch count increments. I think that maybe my foot is just differently shaped than hers, so there are just so many also beautiful free patterns on Ravelry where I can fiddle with them if I need to, and I'm not feeling frustrated because I spent all that money. So obviously that's a very personal and kind of a hot topic in the knitting community, I'm sure. So I'm not saying that a pattern is not worth that amount of money. I'm just saying that when I buy a pattern, in my mind, the reason why I'm spending that money is for the convenience sake of not having to figure it out myself. Instead, I can just follow the directions. So I'm sure that I'll knit more of her patterns from the books that my library has, though. She has a really lovely design aesthetic. Oh, the other thing I wanted to talk about is, so even though this sock is offered in multiple sizes, it's not the panel of decoration. Here, it's easier to see on this one. The panel of decoration stays the same in every size. And I noticed that on the Audrey and Unst cardigan too, which I knit last month, and it's got those decorative kind of lace open work right here. And that's the same size on every shape cardigan, which means that as you're knitting a larger size of sock or cardigan, you're having more stockinette compared to the decorative, or in this case more ribbing, compared to the decorative bits. And that just seems questionable to me. I don't know. I would find that frustrating if I were knitting the larger sizes. And I was a little worried because the model sock, the one in the photos, is the 64 stitch count, so I was a little worried that it would look awkward for the 56 stitch count because that means there's more design than ribbing, but I liked how it turned out. So I really love these socks. I'm really glad that I knit them. They were very fun despite all of my whining. And I cannot wait to wear them, and I named them my Mysteries of Udolpho socks, because my favorite Gothic novel is The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. It is wonderful, and the heroine is very self-contained and sorts out her own problems. I think I assumed before I had read this book that kind of 18th century Gothic novels had very useless, flighty heroines, and at least in this one, that is not the case at all. She definitely is working hard to sort things out herself, so. We're almost there, guys. Next up, I will talk about more softies. Even though I didn't knit these at the same time, they use the same pattern, so I will talk about them at the same time. Aren't they lovely? So this one is a wood thrush, and this one is a crow. And they're both from Sarah Elizabeth Kellner's Songbird pattern, which is a free pattern on Ravelry. And I know her name, even though I almost never know designers' names. And I actually messed up a few episodes when I showed the moth mitts and I said they were by Erica Luder. That is not the case. She very sweetly messaged me on Ravelry and told me that nope, that was not her pattern. She's the designer of the Hermione's Everyday Socks, as well as a lot of other patterns, so that's why her name was in my head. And the moth mitts were by another Erica, the kind of German last name, but not Luder, so. Anyway, I'm positive that this pattern is by Sarah Elizabeth Kellner because I've knit so many of her designs. And the reason for that is that she makes softies that are very realistic looking for the animal that they're representing. And that is my niece's favorite style of softie. So my niece has frequently chosen her patterns when I ask what she wants for Christmas or birthdays. So I've knit her raccoon, a lot of bunnies. I know I've knit other stuff too, it's just not coming to me. Squirrel. Yeah. And I know I've knit a couple, at least one or two others. Anyway, so when I saw the Songbird pattern, which she put out earlier this year in honor of her new granddaughter, whose name is Ren, I knew that I wanted to try it eventually. There we go. Here's the wood thrush. Isn't she sweet? And she was the first one that I knit. And the brown is Quince & Company Lark in Gingerbread. That is this really beautiful warm brown. It was left over from a hat I knit for one of my neighborhood friends last year. And then the cream is left over Classic Elite Woodland, which is a nettle wool blend that I used to knit my swan sweater, and had a bunch left over. So apparently, instead of knitting any kind of cozy memory blanket, I'm just going to knit softies with my leftovers. And here are her wings. I really love how she turned out. So the impetus for deciding to try this pattern now was another thing with the Harry Potter house cup. And it was a timed thing, and the prompt was you had to knit something that would help you catch or lure a magical creature to you. And so I knew I wanted to knit this pattern, and so I looked in this Pottermore Encyclopedia of Magical Creatures. I'm not terribly well versed on the Harry Potter world. Anyway, and I found a North American magical creature that likes to eat birds and frogs, and so this was my lure for that magical creature, although I promise my little wood thrush will not be eaten. And I decided to make her a wood thrush because these were the colors yarn that I had, and I really wanted to follow the pattern as it was the first time. So I didn't want to pick a bird that was super complicated and would require more color changes. So the only thing that I changed was adding the duplicate stitch spots because wood thrushes are spotted. They're actually more spotted than this, so I should probably add some more spots. And then I did 6mm plastic safety eyes instead of embroidery, because whenever I try to embroider eyes on softies, they end up looking mildly evil. So this pattern is brilliant, even for her, and all her patterns are brilliant in that she uses short row shaping and decreases and increases to make the shape of the animal. So it doesn't matter if you're good at stuffing or not, because it already has its own shape. But this one, it was just extra brilliant. So you knit the body and head flat. So, well, with the body you're using intarsia to get this differently colored chest. And so you start out and you're just knitting this flat piece of fabric and it doesn't look like much, and then all of a sudden it starts to look, it gets that curve, and then you knit the tail, and then you come back and you pick up stitches for the top of the head and the bottom of the head, and you knit those separately and seam them together. But as soon as you start knitting the top of the head, it starts taking shape like in front of you on your needles, and it's so much fun to knit. And then you knit the wings separately, and they are knit in the round. So you have the stocking out on both sides, and you sew those on. So there is more seaming. Most of her patterns don't require much seaming, but because of the intarsia and the different colors, in this case, you kind of had to. And now that I know how the pattern works, I really want to be knitting all kinds of different birds, because I just think it's such a wonderfully shaped pattern that my camera does not want you to admire in focus. So I knit her, and I loved her, and she's been sitting up in, oh, you can't see where she's been sitting, but she's been sitting on top of the terrarium. And then I decided, when I was thinking about the Deep Dark Night knit along, that I really wanted a crow to add to my seasonal decor, and that's because Dixie Girl, when I was talking about knitting pumpkins on my last episode, mentioned that she had gotten out her crow, and I was very jealous that I did not have a crow to get out from my apartment. So I knit this up, and of course crows are much bigger than songbirds. So the first difference that I made was this was knit in worsted weight yarn on size 3 needles. This was knit with worsted weight yarn held double, so essentially chunky yarn, on size 5 needles. And that was the only difference I made, and you can see that the size is pretty dramatic. I don't think it's as proportional, you know, I'm pretty sure adult crows in real life are bigger than adult wood thrushes on a larger scale than this, but at least it's a more substantial bird. And the only actual modification I made to the pattern is the beak. Nope, we're just going to focus on my face desperately staring at the camera. Hang on a sec. Okay, so I added 2 extra rows to the top and bottom of the head right before the bind off for the beak. So right in here, there's 2 extra rows on both sides, because crows have much chunkier, sturdier, longer beaks than songbirds do, because crows are awesome and need giant beaks. Anyway, so that was the only modification I made to the pattern. If I were making it again, I might change, well, I am going to make it again, and I'm not going to do this, but if I were a stickler, I might mess with the wing shape a little too, because these wings seem a little elegant for crows, but I really love how she turned out. And this was also leftover yarn. It was Barocco Modern Cotton, which is a cotton rayon blend in black that was left over from a friend asked me to knit her some arm warmers, and this was the yarn she picked out. So I was glad that I had the leftover, because I don't wear black myself, and almost no one in my family ever asked for black things to knit. This Christmas, my niece's request is black, but that's in the future. So I really don't have black yarn, usually. But I had enough of this. It took a lot of yarn because I held it double. I think it took 45 grams, something like that. This one, even this one took more yarn than the pattern calls for. It took I think 12 grams of the brown, and then, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 grams of the cream. So my yardages are higher than the pattern calls for, but in this case, that's because it's held doubled. And I wanted to hold it double, not just to make it bigger, but also because I didn't want any of the stuffing to show through. So it's stuffed with white stuffing, and you really can't see that at all. So I'm really pleased with that, even though it was not super fun to knit the chunky weight yarn on size 5 needles, but I survived. Yeah. So I love her, and I set up this really fun photo shoot. She has 8mm safety eyes instead of 6mm ones. If I had had solid black ones, I would have opted for that because I think usually the solid black looks better. But my 6mm solid black looked too small, and it turns out adult crows do have brown eyes, so it is at least authentic. The juveniles have blue eyes. I totally would have made her a juvenile if I had the right color eyes. Anyway, woo, nerdiness. So I love her, and I set up this really fun photo shoot on Instagram, fun for me, for the knit along, and my sister saw it, and she was saying that she would like a crow. Halloween is her and my niece's kind of favorite holiday. They go all out. They've got these giant spiders, and by giant I mean like 5 or 6 feet, you know, my size, that they put on their ceiling and stuff, and they do this big Halloween themed party, and so it makes sense that they would want a crow to go with it. But as I said, I don't have much black yarn. I only had 20-something grams left over after knitting this one, which isn't enough to knit another one. So at first I was going to just order some more yarn, but I realized I could just give this crow to my sister, and I don't care whether, because I was worried that I could either order from Knit Picks, which would, but it's a 9 to 14 business day thing, and I want to make sure my sister has the crow by Halloween. And as I mentioned, my dad is coming to visit in a couple weeks, so then I could just send the crow with him and save myself a trip to the post office. But then I wasn't sure if the Knit Picks yarn would get in time, and it just seemed really stressful. I didn't want to have to be knitting to a deadline, so I'm going to send this little crow to my sister. Also, she's got way more pets than me, and more kids run around her house, so I think a machine washable crow would be nicer for her. And I'm going to knit myself another crow with some black wool yarn that I'm going to buy. Probably from Knit Picks. Their Wool of the Andes chunky. Seems like it would make a nice crow. So, yeah. It will be a little hard to say goodbye to her, but I will be able to knit myself more. So, if I have time, I might knit a juvenile crow for my niece, although I don't have the right blue eyes. But I know my niece really loves little things, and then having like mom and baby or auntie niecey sets. So. Yeah, it's really funny. I used to hate knitting stuffed animals. I only knit them for my niece, and only because she loved them so much, and it was like pulling teeth. But these days I really enjoy them, and it seems to be the way that I'm choosing to use up a lot of my leftovers. So I find it more entertaining than knitting garter stitch squares. Good thing I knit in lots of like animal colors, you know. And so one more finished object, and then I'm done. So this is a hat, and once I finished knitting it, I called it the 90s nostalgia hat because these colors remind me so much of this like windbreaker jacket my mom had when I was a kid. I'm 31, so I was born in 1986, so I was pretty much a kid in the 90s. It was not intentional, but hopefully I knit it as a gift knit for strangers. I don't like the phrase charity knitting. It makes me feel like, I don't know, I'm some kind of Lady Bountiful who needs to get up a hamper and go visit the parish poor or something. I don't know. I'm uncomfortable with that idea. But I've been knitting hats when I feel like it. So far I've only done them for kids. I'm going to do some for adults too, because there's a local shelter here in my area that is perfectly fine with 100% wool hats. I have no interest in doing acrylic charity knitting, so for a variety of reasons, both environmental and personal, I don't like knitting with acrylic. So once I discovered that, and I want to wait until I have a whole bunch, and then I want to mail them all in before winter starts, so that'll be in another month or two. I think I've got 5 now. Yeah, so I knit up another one. I've been using leftover Barocco Ultra Alpaca that I have in my stash, and it's a cobalt blue color, but after I knit 3 hats with the cobalt blue, that was a full skein, I got bored with it. So the next skein I overdyed, so that's where the teal color comes from. And then the cream is that same woodland yarn that I used for the bird. And the hot pink is Knit Picks Precioso, which is 100% worsted weight merino in Pokeberry. And that I bought specifically for these hats because it's important to me that they not be itchy at the brim, which is, of course, what's touching you when you're wearing a hat, as long as you have hair. So I thought knitting hats where the body was Barocco Ultra Alpaca and then the brim was something softer was the perfect solution to that. So this is the third, because that way it makes the softer yarn last longer so I can get more hats out of it, if that makes sense. So this is the third hat that I've knit with that, and I used a free pattern on Ravelry called the Branta pattern. Branta? And it actually would count for the hipster knit along as well because there are fewer than 30 projects, which is funny because I think it's a really nice hat. I like the chevrons. The pom-pom really makes this hat. Before I put the pom-pom on, I was kind of like, hopefully some. I knit it in a kind of tween size, so like age 10 to 13, hoping that some tween would like it because it seems like the 90s are coming back. They're vintage now, which is insane to me. Anyway, so yeah, it was a really good pattern. I modified it a bit to be smaller since I didn't want it to be quite adult size. So I cut out a few rounds of the brim color down here, and then I started the crown decreases at 8 inches instead of 9 inches. But other than that, I saw the pattern. It was really good. The color work is super simple. I think this would be a great first color work project for you. And I mean, I could do it while I was reading. So I like having an extra long brim with these hats because that way, whoever has the hat can choose. They can either wear it more slouchy, or they can fold the brim up. There's a reason I don't wear these style hats, by the way, and I wear berets, but that's okay. And have a more fitted hat. And obviously my head is probably slightly bigger than a tween's. I don't really know. I know that kids have proportionally larger heads, but so there it is. I think it turned out really cute. I was looking for a pattern that used 3 colors of yarn for another Harry Potter house cut prompt, but I really like this. So I have enough yarn to knit 2 more hats with the teal at least, and one more I'll have a pink contrast, and the other one I'll have a yellow contrast. And I think I'm going to do a little more color work there, but I've been doing different hats each time just to make it interesting. And yeah, the Precioso is really nice and soft. It's basically, they're trying to do like a Malabrigo style yarn. And I got it in last year's post-Thanksgiving Knit Picks sale. So the reason why I haven't done a lot of charity knitting in the past is because I thought it made more sense to take the money that I would spend on yarn and instead give it to causes that I believe in. But since this shelter really needs the hats, and I don't think you can buy wool hats for the same price that you can knit them. I think with sweaters, you can buy wool sweaters for less money than you would knit them, especially if you're shopping secondhand. But hats seem to be a different story. So I thought that actually it kind of made sense, especially since the only yarn that I had to actually buy was this pink yarn, because I had no other plans for the Ultra Alpaca. So I'll be starting on the adult hats as soon as I use up the pink and yellow brims, which my niece helped pick, not my colors. We are finally through with finished objects. I thought that I would quickly read to you a little knitting quote that I came across in a book I was reading last night. This is The Swallow, A Ghost Story, and I pretty much picked it for the cover. When I was at the library yesterday, I did a catalog search for ghost, and this is a children's book. Well, juvenile is how it's classified. And it's by Charis Cotter, who is Canadian, and it's set in Toronto in the 60s. And I found it very sweet and good. It's not... it's not the kind of literature that jumps into my soul, you know? But it was a really lovely way to spend a couple hours reading. And I liked the ghost aspects of it. It's definitely not a horror kind of ghost story. However, even though it is a children's book, there are, obviously with ghosts, there's going to be grief and death and that kind of thing. So, depending on your kid, I mean, I can't recommend what to read to your kid. For a long time, my niece didn't even like words like cemeteries or ghosts, and she still won't go into cemeteries, whereas I was the kind of kid who spent the time reading horror ghost stories, and so I really just think it depends. But I would call it kind of more melancholy than anything, but in a nice way. Anyway, it's about these two girls who live next door to each other and discover that their attics share a wall and they can talk through that wall, and that's how they meet. And both, since they live next door to each other, their houses both overlook a cemetery. And one of the girls can see ghosts, and the other one is really into ghosts but has never seen one and really hopes that she can. So, and it's narrated from both their points of views. And this is a passage from Rose, who is the little girl who can see ghosts. They're not that little, they're 12 and 13, I believe. Okay. So after supper, I returned to my grandmother's room. I turned on the pretty stained glass lamp and looked around at the mess. Tissue paper, shoes, and boxes in a jumble on the floor. The sad clothes laid out on the bed. A few boxes were piled in a corner, still unopened. I sat down in the middle of it all and started putting away the shoes, carefully wrapping them in tissue again. It reminded me of when I was little, putting my dolls to bed. I had gone through a stage of dressing them all in makeshift nightgowns and setting them in cradles and shoebox beds, all in a row. Every night I had to do it before I went to sleep. My mother would try to hurry me up, but I had to make sure each one was carefully tucked in. Sometimes the old lady ghost would appear, rocking and knitting, smiling at us all, dolls, child, mother. I don't know why, but there among the shoes and tissue I began to cry. I felt lost, as though someone had died and the world wasn't the place it was supposed to be. Never mind, came a familiar voice from the corner. Never mind, dear. I looked up. The old lady had appeared in the easy chair by the window, knitting. I hadn't seen her since the summer when I was so ill. Who are you? I whispered, getting up and drawing closer to her. Why do you come to me? I was at her feet now. She looked as solid as the chair she was sitting in. She was very old, shrunken and wrinkly, but her thick, arthritic fingers moved quickly in rhythm, and the needles clacked industriously. What are you knitting? I asked, examining the soft mauve wool that puddled on her lap. She smiled at me. It's for you, Rose, she said in her soft, sweet voice, to keep you warm. You're going to need it. I laid my head down against her knees then. I could feel her thin bones against my cheek, and she was strangely warm for a ghost. Can you help me? I asked. Can you tell me what's going on? The knitting needle stopped clicking, and she stretched out her hand and stroked my hair. Yes, I can help you, Rose, she said softly. I'm watching over you always. You'll figure it out soon. Don't worry. Then she was gone, and I was leaning against an empty chair. So, I thought that was a really sweet moment. And I will not tell you more about the story, since, I don't want to accidentally spoiler it, but isn't that cover beautiful? So Rose is the one wearing the black coat, in case you were curious. And she saw that lady knitting in the corner as a baby. Okay, so now I thought that I would tell you briefly about the Harry Potter Knitting and Crochet House Kept group on Ravelry. And the idea is basically that they have recreated Hogwarts as a crafting group. And so you can be sorted into one of the 4 houses. If you don't know about Harry Potter, I'm really you can search for it on the internet. But Hogwarts is the boarding school that magical witches and wizards are sent to in England. When they turn 11, they receive an invitation letter. And once they arrive, they're sorted into one of 4 houses. And so that determines where they sleep and who they eat with and who they go to classes with. And there's always a house cup going on. And students can earn points for their houses and lose points for their houses from bad behavior. Or just irritating Professor Snape. In the Ravelry group, what that means is you earn points for your house by turning in assignments, which are finished objects. And any kind of fiber craft is always allowed. Well, I don't know about sewing, but spinning, dyeing yarn, knitting, crocheting, Those are always welcome, and there are always prompts for each. And then some classes allow what they call non-Ravelry crafts. So that would be sewing, woodworking, anything like that. So I think they go out of their way to be as inclusive as possible. And it's really nice. There's no yardage minimum on the homework assignments. And even though most things have to be finished objects in pairs, blanket squares count as finished objects. So that way you could just do that if you wanted. And the minimum you have to do in order to participate is 1 finished object a month, or you can even turn in a partial object for partial class credit, so it doesn't even really have to be finished. So I think it's set up in a really welcoming and inclusive way, and you can kind of pick the level of participation that you're at. So I'm currently not in a house because I found it right after the fall term had started in September, and you're sorted into a house at the beginning of every term. So I had missed the sorting, but that's fine because you can still play along as what they call a not quite first year. So you can turn in assignments and everything. You're not getting points for a house, but you do get these pretty little badges to put on your project page. And it kind of is helping me figure out what it all looks like with lower pressure, since I don't have to worry about helping out my house members, that kind of thing, until next term. And the terms are 3 months long, and then there's a month-long break. So each month of the 3 months, there are 8 classes. Some of them are always there, and then others, the subject rotates. And the professors give you a different assignment. And they're quite broad and open-ended. Like this hat for Charms class, it was use 3 distinct colors. The leg warmers I used for the Patronus seminar, which was Craft Your Bliss. The scarf was for one of the classes where you just had to, wands lore. You could knit something that was 50% purple. And so, as I said, it's very open-ended, and if you can creatively fit your assignment into something, it seems like the professors enjoy seeing that. So those are the month-long classes, and the only real rules is that you have to have started it in that month as well as finished it. If you started it in a previous month and finished it, you can put it in detention instead, which I think is fun. So that's the only thing that might affect my knitting that makes me a little nervous. I don't want to wait to start knitting something towards the end of the month just because of the classes, if that makes sense. But I don't think that would change my knitting behavior too much. So basically it's set up in a way that makes it pretty easy to keep crafting what you want to craft, but also having more camaraderie and more incentive for finishing things. And what I really like about the classes is that they encourage me to do those smaller kinds of projects that a lot of times I've been wanting to do for quite a while, or, like trying out the songbird pattern, that kind of thing, using up scrap yarn, but haven't necessarily done because I get distracted by like sweater knitting. So and it's just really fun. I cannot imagine how much work the people who run this group are putting into it, because every student that turns in homework gets a personal reply from the professor, which there are hundreds and thousands. I mean, these threads are gigantic. And there's the introductions to every thread. It's kind of like it involves a story, like it'll be narrating what the different professors look like you're in the classroom reading it. So I really like that aspect of it too, as someone who enjoys stories. I've never played role-playing games, but I'm guessing that that's kind of what they're like. Not because I look down on role-playing games, it just was, I don't know, it never appeared in my life. Anyway, just wanted to clarify that I definitely don't look down on anything like that. I think it's awesome. And so in addition to the classes, which I have been really enjoying trying out those different prompts, they also have advanced studies. Well, and they have, one kind is the Order of the Phoenix. So those are projects that are going to take longer than a month, but aren't too big, and you don't have to be very specific in those, because the idea is you're going undercover and being secretive. So those are for people who don't like to plan and commit a lot ahead. And then the more involved advanced studies are the Owls and Newts, which of course you would recognize from Harry Potter. or just the British education system, which is not like the American one. Anyway, and so you have them in specific subjects, and they have a variety of prompts that you can use, and then you have to craft a proposal, and that proposal has to include photos of your yarn and your swatches you have to swatch, and a whole lot of detailed plans. And that is just right up my alley. That's kind of how I think about knitting anyway. I tend to like to explore different aspects of knitting at one time. And so adding a more formalized thing to it is just really fun for me. I was one of those people who thrived in a school environment, and I have always loved reading books about boarding school, whether magical or not. So it's right up my alley, and even though this is my first term participating, I have definitely signed up for one of the Order of the Phoenix missions, and also an owl. I can't do a newt until I have 4 owls. You can, oh my gosh, you can tell that I'm a natural student. I would love to just have been a student forever with like 400 majors at college. Anyway, and so I'm doing a lace owl because I feel like I've been studying lace a lot these past few months. I did that self-designed lace cardigan out of sparrow linen yarn, and then I did that lace stole on the bias that I used a pattern for, but I had never knit on the bias. And I just feel like it would be fun to kind of do a culmination of my lace knitting. So I'm doing a charms owl this term with a cardigan and cowl, which are both self-designed, but I'll talk more about that in my next episode when I talk about my works in progress. So I think that if you enjoy having some outside incentive as well as a lot of camaraderie, in addition to all the support from the professors and that kind of thing, there's also a lot of chatting that goes on, then this is definitely something that you should explore, whether you are super obsessed with Harry Potter or not, which I liked Harry Potter. I'm the same age as Harry Potter, so I read the books as basically I grew up with Harry and Ron and Hermione, which was an interesting experience. So I have read all the books. I have not seen all the movies, and especially the first 3 or 4 books I really loved and read a lot when I was younger, and I think I'm going to reread those ones. The later ones are a little too sad for me. I never like war novels, so I kind of avoid those. But anyway, yeah, if you just enjoy that kind of structure, or if you're looking for, I don't know, inspiration to knit, maybe, I really like that it encourages me to knit up kind of stash yarn like I used for my wood thrush, that type of thing. And then this term especially, I'm really using it to help getting all my Christmas knitting done. Like the Order of the Phoenix mission is a lace scarf for my mom that's on my Christmas list. So I just think it's really exciting and really fun, and I thought that I would tell you about it in case you hadn't heard of it. It's very inclusive and very welcoming, and you can join in now and just play along the way I am as a not quite first year, to be sorted for the next term. So we will see how that goes. I'm hoping that I end up in Ravenclaw, just because I think that that's naturally, I think at my core, I am bookish and curious and into knowledge for knowledge's sake, and that all seems like a Ravenclaw thing. But I'll be happy no matter what house I'm sorted into. And so yeah, if you're looking for something to maybe shake up your crafting a little, or make some new knitting friends, that kind of thing, then definitely look into the House Cup. And finally, I'm just going to do a brief review of Vintage Modern Knits by Courtney, Kelley, and Gagnon Osborn. So the idea behind this book, which was published by Interweave in 2011, is that the 2 designers have taken a lot of traditional knitting styles from around Europe and the UK and kind of imagined them into slightly more modern knits, like, oh, and I guess this one is inspired by China. It's called the Yangtze cardigan. Ooh. So there's a combination of garments and accessories in here, and I think that they're all lovely. I really love the designer's aesthetics. However, I would not recommend this to a beginning knitter because I think that there are the patterns that I've knit have pretty much all required some tweaking in order to fit well or to work exactly right. I think the only thing that I haven't had to tweak at all was the Yvette hat, which is the Rositude technique. Hang on. And when I tried to knit fingerless mitts out of this book very early in my knitting career, it was an exercise in huge amounts of frustration and anger, and I never wear those mitts. It wasn't just the pattern, it was also the yarn. Yeah, there's the Yvette hat. So I think that this book is full of really beautiful inspiration that as long as you have a little bit of knitting under your belt, enough that you can see where things aren't going to quite work for you, like the thumbs for the mittens that I made a couple weeks ago, and change it accordingly, then it is definitely worth looking into. But if you're a brand new knitter, I would be a little cautious. Maybe if you read the project pages so that you get an idea of where other people have adapted things. But I absolutely love the aesthetic, and I think that the photos are really beautiful. So as far as eye candy goes, this book is wonderful if you enjoy kind of feminine, vintage, retro feel to your knitwear. And I've used this book to learn several new techniques actually, which is really nice. It doesn't include a huge amount of instruction, but that's really what Google and YouTube are for, and it definitely includes a little bit. It includes a little bit about the history of each of the traditions, and so I love it for inspiration. I'm trying to see if there's one of the sweaters that I really like. Focus. That blue one with the cream. I think that's really neat. So I'm really pleased that my library has this, and I'm sure that I will knit more patterns from this book because I really enjoy it. I just enjoy it more now that I have a bit more experience. I would buy my own copy if I could find it used or if my library didn't have it, but as it is, I prefer to just check it out when I need it rather than making space for it on my own shelves. But yeah, I would definitely suggest that you look into the book if you're interested in that kind of knitting, and I really think that the designers have an absolutely wonderful eye, and I mean, just, there is a variety, like, it's not all, I mean, so there's that mitten and hat set, and that seems more kind of bold, graphic, you know, versus the girly things that I tend to knit. So there really is a variety, and I just think it's all really interesting. I'm distracted looking through the book again. So I tend to prefer to buy books that are reference books instead of pattern books and rely on my library for pattern books. But I know that not everyone has a library that is as well stocked as mine. And I think that just look at the projects on Ravelry, and if you like enough of them, then it is definitely worth buying because it's just a treasure trove of lots of different techniques, and then imagining how those techniques work in pieces that don't make you feel like you're dated, I guess. I don't know. I don't really worry about that personally myself. I just embrace the quirkiness. But yeah, a lot of their yarn choices are with the fiber company yarn. They might all be, and that's because these designers are connected with that company, and that yarn is pricey yarn. It's luxury yarn in my world. So I have always substituted yarn, and you, depending on your budget, you might need to do that too, especially if you're a beginning knitter, so you're not used to how much yarn can cost. It took me a while to adjust to that. So that's something else to keep in mind, but I think it's a really interesting resource, and it definitely, a lot of pattern books, I only like 1 or 2 patterns out of the entire book, but this book, I really love almost all the patterns, even if I wouldn't knit them all. So, yeah. Just be cautious about some of the adaptations that you might need to do. And a lot of the projects really haven't been knit that much on Ravelry, which surprises me because they are so lovely. But I like that lace cardigan a lot too, the ginger lace cardigan. And we have come to the end of a very full episode. I'm not going to apologize for knitting a lot, which requires talking about a lot of knitted things. I mean, that seems kind of weird to apologize for. But hopefully my next episode will not be so long. I always feel bad when they run long, but you can always pause, right? I guess the only thing I have left to say is I forgot to mention at the beginning, I am wearing my Sugar Plum cardigan, which I designed myself. I used the Hermione Everyday sock pattern for the main texture, and then I used some Guernsey designs from Barbara Comwin's traditional Guernsey book for the yoke. And it's out of Quince & Company Turn yarn, which is my very favorite sweater yarn. It's American wool 70%, I think, and 30% Tussa silk in dusk, which is an absolutely beautiful mauve color. And then the contrast button band is Chanterelle in Quince & Company Finch. I'm not sponsored by Quince. I just love their yarn. So yeah, that is what I am wearing today. And I'm really glad that you all sat with me and listened through all of this. As I said before, I love to hear from you, so feel free to comment here or on Instagram or Ravelry. I have not been very present socially online in the last couple weeks, and that is because of what's been going on outside of my knitting life. So hopefully I'll be able to get back into the swing of things, and I miss everyone on Instagram and stuff. So I will see you guys next week when I have a whole bunch of works in progress to talk about. It's knitting time, you guys. Autumn has arrived here in the Northern Hemisphere. So you gotta make the most of it while it's here. Oh, I need to drag over my puppy so she can say goodbye too. I know you guys like that. Come on, Thistle. Hi, baby. Come on. Oh, so slow. So, from Thistle, Moth has started running as soon as I picked Thistle up. From Thistle, Moth, and me. Goodbye for now, and I will see you again soon.